Hey grade 10s, today we're going to look at the formation of ions. So how we go from an atom to an ion. So actually, most matter on Earth is found as either a compound or a molecule. There are not a lot of things that exist as single atoms or single elements. So in fact, compounds and molecules are the most stable form for matter to be in. And that's because for an atom to be stable, they need to look like a noble gas. And what we saw earlier when we were talking about atoms is that a neutral atom doesn't necessarily have its valence shell full. So for an atom to be stable, it needs to have that full outer shell of electrons. So if it only has one electron orbital, then it should have 2 electrons in there to be full. If it has 2 electron orbitals or 3 or 4, then it needs to have 8 and we call it a stable octet because most of them have 8 electrons in that outer shell. So their octet is for 8. So to become a stable atom and to have a full outer shell of electrons, atoms are going to have to gain or lose electrons. And when they do that, we call it an ion. So an atom will form an ion when it gains or loses an electron. So an ion is actually an electrically charged atom, and we call its charge an ionic charge. So there are 2 types of ions that can form. If an ion loses or gives away its electrons in its outer shell, so 1 or more electrons, then we call it a cation, and it will have a positive charge. So metals, the elements that are on the left side of the periodic table, will tend to form cations. They will tend to form positive ions. They'll give away the electrons that are in their outer shell. And that's usually because they only have 1 or 2 or 3 electrons in that outer shell. So it's easier for them to give away 1 or 2 electrons than to gain 6 or 7. So let's just work through an example of how an atom forms an ion. So here we have, we're going to work through beryllium. So here comes beryllium. This is the neutral atom for beryllium. It has 4 total electrons, 2 electrons in its outer shell, so 2 valence electrons. So beryllium actually has 4 protons, 4 electrons, and 5 neutrons, and that makes it a neutral atom. But it is not a stable atom. Okay? For beryllium to become stable, it needs to get rid of those 2 electrons that are in that valence shell. So we're going to take those electrons away. And beryllium is actually going to drop a valence level. And so now we have still 4 protons. Okay, so an atom is never going to lose its protons, but now it only has 2 electrons. We've lost 2 electrons. So the overall charge for beryllium is now +2. Because there's 4 protons, that's +4. We only have 2 electrons now, so we have only 2 negative charges. So our net charge overall is +2. So beryllium is forming an ion that has a +2 charge. It's a cation. So there's the ion. Okay, the valence level is full because there are only the maximum in that first valence is 2 electrons. So it's a full valence and it's stable. Next we have strontium. Okay, so here's just another example. This is with a Lewis symbol. So you can see strontium also has 2 electrons in that valence shell because there's only 2 dots there around strontium. So that means that it needs to lose those 2 electrons. So once it loses those 2 electrons, it has a positive ionic charge +2. Okay, so the other type of ion that can form is called an anion. And so this would be when a neutral atom gains 1 or more electrons. And these are usually the nonmetals that will tend to gain electrons. And so they will have an overall negative charge. Okay, so let's work through an anion example of how the ion would form. So we're going to look at nitrogen. Okay, so here is our nitrogen neutral atom. there are 7 protons in nitrogen's nucleus, and for the atom to be neutral, it will have 7 electrons, and there are also 7 neutrons. Okay, for nitrogen to become stable, it's going to want to gain 3 electrons to fill up that outer valence shell. There's space for 3 more. So it's easier for these non-metal atoms to gain electrons to fill up their shells because they're really only missing usually 1 or 2 or 3. Okay, so nitrogen is going to gain 1, 2, 3 electrons to fill up that outer valence shell. So we still have 7 protons, that never changes, but now we have 10 electrons. Okay, so the overall charge for the nitrogen ion is going to be -3. Our valence is now full, and our ion now has a -3 charge. So that's basically how ions form from atoms. Another example is bromine. So here we have our Lewis symbol for bromine. It's a non-metal, and it's only missing 1 electron in that outer valence shell. So this is one of those halogens. It's highly reactive because it just really wants to fill up that valence with 1 more electron. So it's going to gain that electron, and so it'll have an ionic charge of -1. Okay, so that's basically how atoms form ions. And next time we're going to talk about how ionic compounds form. So I'll see you soon.